This is Reframe, the podcast from the College of Education, Health, and Society on the campus of Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. Applying to college can be both thrilling and overwhelming. The process can be undeniably alluring for those eager to jumpstart their future. And yet for many, the stress involved is also very real, especially now amid a global pandemic that has upended nearly every aspect of life. This year, many college applications may be missing not only ACT and SAT scores, as many universities have now gone test optional, but also a variety of other factors, like many extracurricular activities that once set applications apart. And things not only look different for students, the landscape has also changed for college admissions professionals who are also scrambling to navigate this new reality. So on this episode, we're here with Bethany Perkins, the Director of Admissions here at Miami University. She's here to talk about what college admissions looks like right now, how things have changed, and what parents and students need to know to make the best choices possible. Bethany, thank you so much for being here today.
You're welcome. It's a pleasure to be here.
So let's start off with just kind of the big overview question. Now, in this time of COVID, which has changed so many things, what is the college admissions process like? How has it changed? And even on top of the pandemic, what are some things that parents need to realize about admissions that may be very different from what either they experienced recently or even in the past when they once went to college?
Yeah. No, it's a great question. I think it's easier to start with what hasn't changed. And that's that there is still so much at a student's digital fingertips when it comes to exploring colleges and universities and getting a feel for what in a campus community speaks to them. So even pre-COVID, we've seen such a transition to what students have access to on the internet. But in COVID, that is most likely the primary mode of a student's search process. And it will most likely be all virtual for a lot of institutions through to a student being admitted right now. So I would say what's changed is that we've got to buck up and get over our Zoom fatigue that we're all experiencing, because we're going to be going to information sessions and virtual tours and having one-on-one meetings with counselors all online. And there are limited tours available at some institutions at Miami. We hope to start giving tours in September here soon. We miss having students on our campus and cannot wait. And what makes this different, I think, for parents who went through this, 15 years ago or so did I. This is a different world. I could not have fathomed having 4,000 institutions to choose from. I could not have fathomed having access to their virtual tours and their information, and so in the world I applied to colleges in, I really only visited a few colleges and universities. It was a lot of word of mouth or whose parent went to such and such college or university. And now that a student can so easily go to multiple search sites and put in what's important to them to spit out a laundry list of colleges and universities that might be a good fit, that's a totally different game. It's also a very different world because higher education is a lot more expensive than it was 15 to 20 years ago. And our conversations now are still about the experience, but they're also now about the return on investment. And we are answering a lot more questions now about career outcomes, average salary, likelihood to get a job. And those are important. I think it's very valuable to have those conversations. I wish it wasn't in the context of a lot of parents worried about their finances, a lot of students worried about financial security 3, 4, 5 years from now. But admission professionals and institutions, we're ready to answer those questions, or we should be, because it's important.
And you mentioned a big number there, 4,000 institutions that could be at the fingertips of a student. When it comes to the schools that students are thinking about applying to, how many schools should they be reasonably thinking about? Is there just too many? Is there something that at some point they should be realistically looking at 20 schools? I know schools are very different from one another in certain aspects, but are they that much different where they need to be looking at more than 20 schools or whatever that number may be?
No, it's a great question. And 17-year-old me is the worst person to ask this question because I looked at too many, I applied to too many, I had no idea what I wanted. So I'll share that there's no magic number that a student should have, but if a student is looking at an array of options in their sophomore year, at the beginning of their junior year, to just figure out what speaks to them and what's important to them, that's great. And if at any point that it feels like it's too many, everything's blurring together, the visits are blurring together, it probably is too many. It's time to sit down, think about what's important, and to narrow the list down. So let's say it's senior year for anyone who's listening or watching, and there is still a list of 20 schools. At that point, I would challenge a student that this might be too many, and if applying to 20 schools, this might be too many. The average student applies to about 10 colleges and universities. I would say that's a pretty good rule of thumb to try and keep it to that number or under. And really the process, there's no right way to do it. And it's really going to go student by student.
What would you suggest about a good time to start thinking about college? Is it ever too early?
I don't think it's ever too early to start thinking about college. And I don't think it's too early to explore. There are times I think it's too early to put too much pressure on oneself. There are times I think it's too early to reach out to an admission representative about how you can get in. We are pretty incapable of giving you very clear direction as a sophomore in high school on how to get in 2 years from now. But when it comes to searching and exploring, I say sophomores, we're sending you mail now as a sophomore. So it's not too early to actually collect it and flip through and to put aside those that really speak to you and not throw them away quite yet. And for juniors, it's not too early to start virtually or physically visiting campuses to get a feel for what is important to you and what just feels right. And then for seniors, it's never too early to start putting together a list of the schools that one is interested to and getting the deadlines all in a column, getting honors opportunities all in a column, and really figuring out what the chances are for admission as best as one can.
And there's so many different factors that people have to consider when getting into college. And this is something that also may be very different now in the age of COVID. But what are some of the factors that it takes to get into a good school? People have to balance grades and maybe at one time test scores. I know that may be changing now. Prep courses, there's extracurricular activities. Now there's so many different things. Now is that daunting to people of what they should prioritize, or are there a certain number of things or certain things in general that should be prioritized, and will things outweigh other things, like will being in a lot of activities outweigh like a bad essay or vice versa?
Yeah. This is a great question because my colleagues and I have had a lot of conversations around what it must be like to be a rising senior right now. I could not imagine going into my senior year with no test scores, with having been transitioned to remote learning whether I wanted it or not, and moved to pass-fail grades in a semester that I really needed to boost my GPA and to show how much I had been improving over my years in high school. And then for the extracurricular opportunities that I was taking advantage of to be potentially cut short. And we have students who were then thrust into being the primary caregiver because parents were essential workers, and they have younger siblings who needed to still be in school, who were virtual as well. I I can't imagine the responsibility and the pressure that must be on parents and students' shoulders right now. But I'll tell you, my colleagues and I are doing a really, really good job of trying to imagine what that must feel like, and to tell students that even though extracurriculars and academics and at some institutions even test scores are important, that most important is a student taking care of themselves right now. And that most important is listing everything that one has participated in, even if that was family childcare, even if that was boosting hours at the part-time job, because it's all one had access to do. And I think right now it's just important, before I tell you that yes, grades still matter, that we are paying attention to the context that we're all living in, and doing our best to take care of our applicants right now. But a lot of us have gone test optional or test flexible, and a lot of students are going to be applying without test scores. So it is still important to prioritize challenging oneself in the most challenging course that a student can, and balance that with the highest GPA, right? So it is a difficult balance to challenge oneself while still maintaining high grades, but both of those things matter very much in the admission process.
Now, with so many schools going test optional, that's been in the news a lot in various ways, and with different schools doing various things. Like, what does that change now for students and for admissions? What can a student, you mentioned context, what can a student do now to show that they are prepared for college? And will that also affect what has traditionally been used to decide merit awards and things like that? What does this really mean if schools are going test optional for people in this age?
Not having test scores will change things for students. I don't think it's going to be as drastic of an adjustment as a lot of students and families may fear right now. And that's because a lot of institutions practice holistic review. So Miami is one of them, and we have multiple factors that we consider when making a decision. We look at the whole picture before deciding whether or not to admit that student. And a test score is very rarely in those cases something that will make or break a student. And there are other institutions, though, that have historically practiced something called evaluative review. So it's usually a few numbers, like a GPA and a test score, and it's put into a formula, and that spits out the decision, right? It's definitely going to make more of an impact at institutions that practice admission review in that way, or at institutions that typically had a minimum GPA and a minimum test score to get into. So just in those three examples there, I think the most important thing for students and families to keep in mind is that it is going to change the admission requirements at each individual college or university, and keeping track of not only deadlines but admission requirements, whether or not that institution is test optional, test required, test flexible, test blind. It's a lot to manage, but those are going to be really, really important this year, particularly for students who are interested in programs where we're less able to get around accreditation requirements in order to admit a student. I think of nursing as one example. That's a program that right now at this time we are requiring test scores for accreditation reasons. So there is always going to be fine print at different institutions, and a student needs to just keep track of those things really well. In this year in particular.
That's a great explanation of how admissions is viewing the changes with whether or not test scores are required or not. But how might it change how the students see themselves and what they perceive as their options? Because test scores at once upon a time would have said, well, I don't have the score to get into that school, so I might as well take that off my list. Are there cases where students now are reaching beyond what they would have otherwise without a test score, or how does it?
Gosh, I hope so. I think this is one of those rare gifts that has possibly come to us from COVID. It's given us practically nothing positive, right? But if this is a chance for a lot of colleges and universities to move toward admission review that prioritizes a student's performance over a longer period of time than just a couple of hours on one day, then hooray. And I think students who, particularly the students who got that first test score and then ruled themselves out immediately, will now think there's a chance for me to really rely on my merits and that I've proven myself in the classroom. I think of one student who applied last year, valedictorian, over a 4.0 weighted GPA, fantastic student, and she needed convincing to apply because of her test score, and she was so worried that would make or break our review. And I love that this student, the same profile applying this year, will say, oh no, I have a really good shot of getting in.
Does that make it equally important to still kind of keep safety schools in mind, because you don't necessarily want to go through all REACH schools, I would imagine?
Absolutely. I would say regardless of the requirements, it's really, really important for a student to, let's say if you're applying to 10 schools, 5 of those schools should be a really good fit in terms of a potential match. And let's leave a couple to be safety schools and a couple to be REACH schools. You never know, especially in a year like this one.
And you mentioned context, too, is becoming more important than ever in the holistic evaluations. And how much does that apply to the high school that students come from? Is the strength of the high school more important now than ever? And how can a parent or student find out what the relative strength of their high school is that they happen to be going to?
I think that's a great question. That does vary a little bit school by school. I think it's really important when meeting with admission representatives, or if you're lucky enough to tour a campus, when touring a campus, to ask, will my child or will I be evaluated within the context of my high school? And that's because at Miami University, our admission review process actually allows for contextual review. We're looking at a student within the context of their high school. We receive a school profile for every application. We know how many AP courses a student had available to them, whether they have access to college credit plus courses in the state of Ohio. We know whether courses were moved to pass-fail, or whether courses are being completed in person or remotely. We know all of that context when we're looking at a student's GPA. So it's not as important as one may think, that a student goes to this ranked high school here versus this high school here, because we're taking those things into account when we're reviewing admission applications.
So if you don't live in a highly rated school district, or if you know that you don't have enough AP courses available that you would like to take, is it better to try, if you have the means, to move to a better highly rated school district where they have the programs and type of things that might help you get into a better school? Or is it more beneficial to stay where you are and just strive to be at the top of your class and the best student you could be there?
I think you just hit the nail on the head, right? Strive to be the best person you can, right? So community member that you can, and strive to be the best student that you can wherever you are. And hopefully you're applying to institutions that value access and value diversity and value your experiences. And I'm proud that I can confidently say, no, this is not about who has the most means, right, to take advantage of the highest level courses and to be able to move from district to district or go to private school. those can benefit students, absolutely. But for the student who doesn't have access to any of those things, to know that we as admission representatives have some tools in our toolkit to keep in mind the courses that were available to a student, and to be able to clearly see a student who is at the top of their class or challenging themselves as much as is available to them. That is huge, regardless of whether that institution or that school is public or private, or what the ranking is.
And one of the things that I definitely want to ask about is the college essay. It's one of the most well-known, maybe one of the most dreaded parts of the application process, depending on how you, how well you gauge your writing skills or creativity. But what are you really looking for in an admissions essay? Is it creativity, personality, accomplishments, writing skill, something else? Is there something that's the most important thing that someone could focus on?
Yeah. I'll answer it this way. The most important questions that we want answered in an essay are, what do I now know about the student's personality? And what do I now know about what drives that student? We have most likely gone through a list of extracurricular activities, and we've seen the transcript. And now I want to know why that student participates in the activities they participate in. I want to know what's really behind all of that. So if a student can accomplish that in a super creative way, and if a student can accomplish that in 3 paragraphs, beginning, middle, and no funny business whatsoever, that student has still done their job. And I will say, standing out, if it can be achieved, is important. And creativity is important, but not at the cost of being professional and being authentic. So we do look that a student has edited. Of course we do. We'd love to see that a student didn't rush things, that they didn't procrastinate, and that they care enough about their application to our university to have gone through it one more time, to capitalize, to punctuate, and really organize their thoughts in a thoughtful way.
Can you tell when an essay specifically does care about your university? Can you tell when an essay has been sent to 10 other essays and 10 other universities, and it's just a generic form essay that's been sent out multiple times? Or how important is it to tailor it to the specific institution that you are applying to if you have 10 in your list?
I love this question because I think what is authentic about a student rewriting an essay to be what they think a college or university wants to see or read? What am I then actually getting that is the true voice and the true personality of the student? So I am all for a strong, authentic, this is who I am essay sent to 10 different institutions, because then you're putting it into our hands to know if this is a role we're looking to fill. And if you have done your job of saying, this is the role that I'm going to play and that I want to play in any campus community that I'm a part of, then again, you've done your job with the essay, and you've done it in an authentic way. You were true to yourself. And I think that's the most important thing. And that's definitely not generic. That's you. That's a voice only you can have. And I would say that it also avoids the potential of me getting an essay accidentally written for another institution. And that has happened more times than I can count in my career. And I would love if a student just avoided putting the name of an institution in an essay altogether.
That seems like at least one thing that should be easily avoided.
Yes.
Are there other things essay related that students should absolutely avoid? One thing that is on a lot of people's mind, obviously, is COVID. Should COVID topics be avoided? Is COVID fatigue a real thing? Or are there other things you just see way too much?
I would say the phrase unprecedented times is something we're all sick of. And I would hope that we don't see that in many essays. But it is really important to recognize that for many applicants, this pandemic has been an upheaval, and it's been transformational. This might be the opportunity for a student to best tell us about their resilience, to best tell us about what they really value, what happens when the chips are down and life is hard. So for the student that can best tell us about what drives them and who they are, even when it's hard, if that's COVID, don't avoid it. Talk about it. And tell us how you've overcome those challenges. It's the student who shares a story that we read a lot, and there is nothing outstanding about it that I worry for. So it's okay to write about the sports injury. Keep in mind, we read about a lot of sports injuries, so there needs to be something outstanding, something we really learn about you. I think, too, we read a lot of essays about a person who influenced a student. And my advice is, if once I get to the end of that essay, I want to admit that parent or that grandparent or that influential person, not you, you probably haven't taken what has influenced you and told us enough about your personality and how it's applied to your life. So just keeping the goal in mind, I think is really important, that we want to know about you regardless of the topic you choose.
Wonderful. So shifting gears a little bit, applying for early admission is another thing that is often on people's minds year after year. How important is it to apply early or to apply for early admission? Does it help or increase your chances with your application? And should you apply early if you're undecided on what you want to study or where you want to go?
So this is a question that I think will potentially add pressure where I wish I didn't have to add pressure in COVID. But it is probably more important than ever to pay attention to those deadlines, to adhere to the deadlines, and to recognize that colleges and universities have undergone serious budget losses in sending students home remotely or even starting remotely this year. And there are going to be institutions out there that have to manage even a scholarship budget very carefully, and we'll probably do that around deadlines. Admission and new students, this is mission critical. So scholarships will still be available to students, but the student who applies late, who misses the deadline and still wants grace, as much as possible, institutions will try and be flexible. But when it comes to scholarships, that's going to be tough this year. So it is really important to pay attention to those deadlines. And when it comes to admissibility, the earlier the better. What students will commonly find is that early decision, which is the binding version of an application deadline, tends to have the highest admit rate at institutions, and then it goes from there. Early action has a higher admit rate than regular decision at a lot of institutions. So the earlier you apply, the better chances of your admission, and also it may be make or break for whether or not a student receives a scholarship or the highest level scholarship available.
That's good to know. And another thing that's on a lot of people's minds is the undecided student. It's sometimes a lot to ask a high school student what they want to study for the rest of their life or what career path they want to put themselves on early. And a lot of people are undecided when they first come to college. So if you don't yet know what you want to major in, what should undecided students look for in their school of choice? Are they better off selecting something they might think they would be interested in, or just staying undecided once they get there?
So I love undecided students. I am full of advice, and that is partly because I can relate and was an undecided student myself in my first year. So a few things. I think look for institutions that have a liberal arts focus, where students are encouraged to study multiple subjects. Ask questions like, can students double major? How easy is it to double major? How easy is it to add a minor at this college or universities? Those are usually good signs that a student who is undecided can come in and have some time to explore. And it's also usually a good sign that a student who comes in having said, I think I want to do this, and then they take that Psych 101 course and it changes their lives forever, right? That those courses can still apply to a different degree, or that there's the possibility of a double major. So I think there are really good questions that a student can ask to make sure that they have a lot of flexibility. Going to a college or university that has a very limited number of majors might not be the best option for an undecided student. But at the end of the day, most of our students are going to graduate and go on to jobs that don't exist right now. Most of our students 10 years from now will be in jobs I can't even fathom at this moment. And there are some programs for which I think a student can be certain and they can know that this profession will always be around. I think about education. I think about healthcare, nursing, and I think about social workers. I mean, the helping professions will always be here, right? We will always need teachers, and we are more appreciative of them than ever, I think, right now. But there are so many other professions that, regardless of a student's major, this is really 4 years to prepare students for career, prepare students for life that doesn't necessarily have a linear path. So it's okay to not be following a linear path to knowing exactly what you're going to major in and exactly what the next 4 years are going to look like.
Yeah, absolutely. What would you say to first-generation college students when they're applying for college? Do you have specific advice for them, or should they approach the process in any certain way?
Find your person. Your admission representative is there to support you and counsel you. And particularly if you have not gone through this process before, you don't have a sibling who's gone through this process or a parent, this is your person. So you find them, you ask them all the questions, and this person will help guide you through the admission process. I think having someone to really go to when you're anxious, or when you don't know if everything got in on time, or if you don't know if you're missing something. I think about how many of our first generation students just don't know what they don't know unless they have a person in their life guiding them and helping answering those questions. Admission counselors, we love our jobs because we love to counsel students. And this gives us an opportunity to show you exactly what that kind of support can look like. So find your person, and other than that, go about this as if you have all of the options available to you early on. Be realistic about the options that you have available. Do you want to stay close to home? Is money a factor? And keep your options open early. But feel free to explore. Don't think because your parents haven't gone through this process that you should limit your opportunities. There are a lot of institutions like Miami that really value first-generation students, and we'll do the best we can to not only admit, but yield you. We want you to be here.
And speaking of things that people don't know what they don't know, another big question on a lot of people's minds, even if they are not a first-generation student or have people that they can count on for resources, is the financial aid process. And navigating the financial aid process can be tricky or very confusing or just have lots of different ins and outs of it. When it comes to the financial aid process, is it all about need as determined by FAFSA, or how are some other ways that people can save money or other factors that may be involved?
Yeah, it is going to vary institution by institution. I think we'll see going into this next year, there are likely going to be more institutions shifting some of their merit dollars to need-based aid, given the influx and increase in requests that we have for financial need. So that will likely be a transition for some institutions, and really both matter. And that's going to vary whether it's a public or a private institution. That will vary. The best advice I can give to a student really concerned at this stage, I'm saying before applying about financial aid, is to not trust the sticker price anywhere, and to not rule things out yet, but to ask good questions. It's okay to ask admission professionals, what percentage of our students receive financial aid, and what is your average merit award, and can you guarantee scholarships if I have a certain GPA? For example, Miami University this year, we've done away with test scores as a minimum requirement for scholarships, and we're able to tell students a 3.5 GPA will earn you a scholarship. Just even having that kind of certainty, a student can move forward in the process and say, okay, I'm going to worry right now about getting in. And once I've gotten in, then I'm going to worry about whether or not this is a financial fit for me and whether or not this is a social and academic fit for me. So I would hope that students can ask a few important questions at the beginning about how accessible financial aid and need-based aid are, to only then just not worry about it for a little while. There is enough to worry about at the beginning of the admission process.
And having that certainty and knowing what to expect can be a big part of how a student chooses which institution to go to. And traditionally, a lot of that gets to what the campus feels like, what it looks like, what they experience when they visit. But what does that look like in COVID? Either virtually or in person? What can people expect with the campus visit in these pandemic times?
I think in COVID, things are going to change next week. So I will tell you how things look now, and things will probably shift. But still, a lot of opportunities are virtual. And if a student does come to campus, they are most likely going to see a few things. They're going to see examples of how they will be taken care of and kept safe, and what our standards are if they want to be a part of our community next year. And we're finding that students and families want to see and hear that. So we'll be proudly requiring masks of our guests. There are some offices of admission that are taking guest temperature before they walk in the doors, or admission offices like ours that will just be asking for a health assessment to be done by oneself before they arrive on campus. And students and families will see a lot of curbside tours where you check in via text and the tour guide meets you outside, and you don't go into buildings. And you'll see a lot of events are still suspended and that we're doing smaller groups on campus. But that's not the case everywhere, and every college or university is doing it a little bit differently. What we have seen a rise in is the DIY or self-guided tour, and we are actually just filming on campus yesterday our tour guide speaking at different points of interest, so that in the future, someone doing a self-guided tour around our campus, if for whatever reason we aren't here and available, they'll be able to scan the QR code and have that experience in that space of a student speaking to that place on campus. I would say more than anything, we want you here. We want you here safely, and that means it's going to look a little bit different, probably for some time.
Wonderful. And a lot of what we've been talking about so far has been predicated on people who have been thinking about college for a while or have been preparing for it in various ways, but there's inevitably going to be some students who maybe they decided they didn't want to go to college and then get inspired by a teacher late in high school and decide maybe it is for me, or they just finally figure out that it's something they do want to do for various reasons, but they haven't yet prepared in a way that maybe would have given them the best chance if they would have started earlier. So what advice do you have for someone who wakes up thinking like, why haven't I thought about college, and what can I do to catch up as quickly as possible?
I love this question. Number one, there is absolutely an opportunity for students to start that search immediately. I think about how I wake up, and if I'm inspired and want to know anything, I have my phone right there, and I can start searching out that information. So I think digitally, there are so many ways for a student to immediately access information about institutions that might be a good fit based on their academic credentials and what their needs and interests are to get started. Secondly, the high school counselor is a great resource, and this is a chance to get over that immediate panic and know that it's going to be okay, because there is someone on staff at the high school dedicated to helping guide students through just these kinds of questions. What are my options now that I'm thinking about college? And I also love the transfer option and the different opportunities that students have now to start at a community college or go to a 2-year college for a program, and to easily see that there are scholarships available, transparent transfer credits and pathways to degrees, and more I see students who maybe wait a little too late for some selective institutions who are able to easily find their way through a satellite campus or a community college because someone comes into their life and says it's not how you start, it's how you finish. And we can start with the degree you want to end up with and find a way there. So there are just a lot of opportunities that students have to change their mind at any time and find a way to a college degree.
There's a lot that goes into the admissions process, and from your perspective, being so immersed in admissions and having your vantage point from being a part of a university and seeing it from so many different levels and from a high level as well, what are some of the things that you've learned from working at admissions that you wish you would have known when applying to college? And is there anything about the process that makes Miami itself unique from the position you have here?
Yeah. So to answer the first part of that question, I wish I'd known how much institutional goals play into an admission decision, and how much it's sometimes not the student, it's them, and that a student really shouldn't get too down on themselves if they're not admitted. Because there are institutional goals that each university has every year that sometimes have everything to do with whether a student is admitted or not admitted, and that has nothing to do with what a student could have controlled in the process. And every institution receives application after application after application each year. And for many of us, Miami included, we have more qualified applicants than we have spaces available. So very often it comes down to shaping the class based on the values and the goals that an institution has. And it's not just about the numbers. That's a great thing. I wish I'd known all that went into the decision that I valued when I got it in the mail, right? But I wish I'd known just how much thought went into making that decision. And I think with Miami University, it wasn't surprising to me, but I still am so inspired by how consistent our admission processes and our admission decisions are with our values. And to be in the room in committee, to be in the room when leadership is really debating and going through and going back to a counselor recommendation before making a decision about a single individual, to see how much time we spend on every application, reading every word, and going back to things like the recommendation, the essay, to what that student can contribute to the community when we have almost 20,000 students on our campus is pretty incredible.
Is there anything that people miss that is obvious or that should be obvious? What are some of the things that nobody ever asks or considers, but they absolutely should?
Oh, that's such a good question. I think what should be obvious to me is that when you have an admission representative on the phone or in front of you at a high school visit and we're giving you our individualized attention, I wish that it was obvious that you can ask questions tailored to your individual experience that you want. And unfortunately, we spend so much time answering questions that are readily available on the website or right there when you get to the admissions section. And it's important for students to know the middle 50% of our students each year, of the GPA and test scores. I completely understand, but I so wish that we were spending more time talking about whether or not we have the clubs and organizations or the major that a student wants and what that's like and what the average salary is for students who graduate. I wish that we were having more conversations like that than we are right now about affordability, about whether or not a student can get in, when some of those things, unfortunately, are just not black and white answers this early in the admission process.
Finally, are there any myths or misconceptions about the application process that you'd like to clear up?
I think that there are two that immediately come to mind. And one myth is that there is one perfect school out there for you. There's not. There are thousands of colleges and universities out there, and being a social and academic and financial fit is very possible at multiple institutions, and that second, third, or fifth school on a student's list might surprise them. So I would say that I hope that students would understand that even though this is a very emotional decision, that very, very often there are multiple great fits out there. And then secondly, especially this year, one of the myths that I would hope to debunk is that an admission office is looking for reasons to deny a student, or we're looking for you to slip up in the admission process. We are offices of admission, not offices of denial, for a reason. And most of us are admitting more students out of our application pool than not. Only at a small handful of institutions are there the admit rates that we see in the news. And I would hope that students would recognize that even if they're worried about their GPA right now or not having a test score or wondering how in the world colleges are going to make a decision about their admissibility, that they would just trust us to do the best we can with all the information given, knowing that we want to admit students who will graduate and be successful and have a fantastic college experience.
All right, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for that look inside the admissions process and all of the great tips, especially during this time.
Yeah, thank you. It was my pleasure.
Bethany Perkins is the Director of Admissions here at Miami University. And thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Reframe Podcast. If you know any parents, teachers, students, anyone who might also be interested in the college admissions process, please share it with them as well. You can find this episode as well as all of our episodes wherever podcasts are found.